You're told you're free, that you can be anything, that you're empowered. But if that's true, why do so many people feel paralyzed, uncertain, and strangely dependent? Why, in a world where independence is preached like gospel, does victimhood seem to hold more social power than strength? We're living in what can only be called the age of the passive soul, a time when the loudest voices claim suffering as status, where fragility is rewarded, and where resilience, the quiet kind, is seen as outdated, even oppressive. This is not a weakness in the traditional sense. It's something far more elegant and far more dangerous. It is a weakness weaponized, sanctified, turned into a new form of virtue. This didn't happen overnight. It began, like most deep transformations, in the mind. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, a condition where repeated failure, constraint, or punishment teaches a being not just that it can't act, but that it shouldn't, that its instincts are unreliable, that surrender is survival. It began in experiments. A dog placed in a cage, shocked randomly. At first, it tried to escape. But after enough failed attempts, it lay down and accepted the pain, even when the door was left open. Now imagine that dog, multiplied into millions. A population taught not just to obey, but to doubt the very idea of self-direction. A culture where freedom is advertised, but conformity is enforced through praise and punishment, not by force, but by social reward. This is the new game, and its currency is victimhood. We now live in a time where personal power is suspect, while public pain is elevated. Adversity becomes identity. Suffering becomes status. And whoever bleeds the loudest wins the crowd. Somewhere along the line, we stopped aspiring to be strong and started aspiring to be seen as hurt, not healed, not rising, just hurts. Permanently, publicly. It's the quiet reward of learned helplessness in a digital age. Every time a person posts their scars and is met with validation, likes, and applause, a tiny voice in the back of their mind learns, this is how I'm valued. This is where I belong. This is who I am. And so, one by one, we put ourselves in cages. Beautiful cages. Transparent, algorithmic, echoing cages, where the bars are made of sympathy and the locks are made of attention. We become like the lion in the glass box, once powerful, now pitied. Still magnificent in form, but no longer feared. No longer free. This isn't compassion. It's containment. It's not empowerment. It's pacification. George Orwell once warned of a future where language would be manipulated to make dissent impossible, where war would be called peace and freedom would be slavery. But we've gone further. Now, weakness is called strength. Silence is called violence. Victimhood is called leadership. We're told we're being protected, but from what? The truth? The risk of responsibility? The uncomfortable weight of our own agency? If you want to see how a society neutralizes rebellion, look not at its police, but at its praise. When strength is mocked and trauma is marketed, when outrage is algorithmically amplified and shame is outsourced to strangers, something begins to rot beneath the surface. The will, the instinct, the fire to stand, alone if necessary. The soul doesn't vanish. It doesn't die. It simply forgets that it once could act. And this is where the danger lives, not in chains that bind the body, but in beliefs that bind the mind. You may believe you're choosing your own path. You may believe you're thinking freely, speaking authentically, living truthfully. But ask yourself, if you were conditioned to feel powerless, if your identity was built on being hurt, if your value came from being seen as small, how would you even know? What if your pain is more useful to others than your potential? Not your healing, not your strength, but your struggle, raw, visible, and never resolved. It sounds cruel, even conspiratorial. But look closer. The systems that surround us, social, digital, ideological, don't just tolerate weakness. They reward it. They elevate it. Not because they care, but because it's useful, containable, profitable. This isn't compassion. It's currency. Friedrich Nietzsche called it slave morality, a value system born not from power, but from its absence. A psychology built by the weak, in which strength is redefined as cruelty and suffering is crowned as virtue. It's not that the powerless learn to overcome. They learn to redefine power itself. In this morality, the lion is condemned for having claws, while the wounded sheep is praised for surviving. But this inversion of values doesn't liberate people. It seduces them into identifying with their limitations and eventually performing them. Consider the child who cries and receives attention, but is ignored when they try. The lesson is subtle but lasting. Pain attracts care. Sadness commands space. Effort is quiet and invisible. So they learn to stay broken, not because they want to, but because they're rewarded for it. Now, scale that lesson across a generation, raised on feedback loops and social platforms, where algorithms don't just reflect behavior, they shape it. Suffering spreads faster than nuance. Outrage generates more engagement than calm reflection. A person sharing their victimhood gains empathy, affirmation, visibility, and the warm, addictive sensation of being seen. Soon, people aren't just hurt. They're incentivized to stay hurt, not because they don't want to heal, but because healing is less visible, less shareable, less rewarded. We have created a golden cage of applause, a cage that doesn't restrain with bars, but with praise. Every time we validate pain without encouraging growth, every time we share tragedy without fostering agency, we polish the cage and convince ourselves it's a throne. And this conditioning doesn't just shape individuals. It shapes entire cultures. In media, politics, and entertainment, the hero's journey is often replaced with the victim's spotlight. Not a narrative of overcoming, but of ongoing affliction. The more wounded you appear, the more righteous your voice becomes. But there's a cost. When weakness is elevated, strength becomes suspect. When victimhood is commodified, resilience is seen as betrayal. We are subtly trained to whisper our achievements and shout our wounds, because wounds build identity. Wounds invite protection. Wounds grant you the moral high ground without ever having to climb. This isn't to say pain isn't real, or that injustice shouldn't be exposed. But when pain becomes a performance, a way to gain power without responsibility, the culture begins to decay from within. It becomes easier to stay small than to risk becoming strong. Easier to be pitied than to be challenged. And so the spiral continues. People aren't just seduced into weakness. They become addicted to the feeling of being seen as weak. Because in this new moral economy, it's safer to be hurt than to be whole. You don't have to change the system when you can be applauded for your suffering within it. But this applause has a price. Your evolution. Because the more your identity becomes entangled with your wounds, the more threatening healing becomes. Growth demands silence, struggle, isolation. But the golden cage demands noise, repetition, and display. And so we arrive at a quiet tragedy. We are taught to wear our chains like medals, and to fear the freedom that comes with no longer needing them. Rebellion once meant risk. It meant exile, persecution, sometimes death. To rebel was to stand alone against the current, to risk everything for something greater than yourself. But today, rebellion is trending. It wears branded slogans. It gathers likes. It sells merchandise. And strangely, it always seems to say exactly what everyone else is already saying. We live in a time where rebellion has become a costume, worn, displayed, and curated to signal difference, without actually being different. A kind of safe rebellion. one that conforms to the aesthetics of dissent but poses no real threat to the structures it claims to challenge. This isn't rebellion. It's roleplay. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to meet the expectations of the world. A necessary adaptation in social life, but also a dangerous illusion. When the persona becomes too convincing, we mistake it for the self. And worse, we mistake performance for authenticity. Modern pseudo-rebellion is a persona. It allows people to feel powerful without being powerful, to feel radical without taking a single personal risk, to chant slogans that sound revolutionary, but were approved by the very platforms that profit from your rage. What if rebellion becomes another form of obedience, just with louder colors? Think about it. The outrage that cycles through your feed, the campaigns that last a week, the movements that explode, then vanish, the slogans that echo not from the streets, but from marketing departments, when every major corporation posts the same activist platitudes, when institutions that once upheld power now speak the language of resistance. Something is off. How can rebellion be real when it's being broadcast by those in power? Because it's not a rebellion. It's containment. Clever kind. A kind that gives people the emotional payoff of resistance without the danger. A rebellion that looks radical, but feels safe, because it never truly asks for sacrifice. It asks for posts, not principles. For hashtags, not hardship. The result is a culture of curated anger. Not the anger that transforms, but the kind that trends. A kind of aestheticized dissent where everyone wears different masks, but all scream the same slogans, loud, proud, and perfectly aligned. This is how the system neutralizes the threat of authentic leadership. It elevates the loudest victims, crowns them as voices of resistance, and turns rebellion into an algorithm. The appearance of change becomes the substitute for actual change. But deep down, people feel it. The hollowness, the repetition. The fact that these performances rarely alter anything fundamental. That behind the screaming and posting, there's still the same quiet fear of being different, of thinking for yourself, of going too far. Because true rebellion isn't popular. It doesn't win you applause. It isolates. It offends. It breaks you before it frees you. Real leadership, then, must begin where the performance ends, when you no longer need to be seen as powerful, when you no longer wear rebellion like a brand, when you stop performing your wounds for validation and start confronting your shadow in silence. That's where it begins. Not in noise, but in clarity. Because rebellion is not about what you say. It's about what you refuse to obey, even when no one is watching. The mask must fall before the leader can rise. And so we're left with a question that cuts deeper than slogans. If most of what we call rebellion is just another costume, then what does true leadership look like, if not this? Everyone wants to change the world, but few are willing to master themselves. We speak of revolution, influence, and transformation, as if leadership begins out there, with systems, institutions, and movements. But this is a distraction, a clever inversion, because true power doesn't begin with control over others, that it begins with sovereignty over the self. The Stoics knew this. Epictetus, once a slave, wrote of a freedom that no empire could grant or take away. You cannot lead the world, he said, if you are a slave to your emotions. This is not a metaphor. It is a psychological law. Most people are ruled by invisible tyrants. Fear, shame, envy, rage. Their decisions are puppeteered by insecurity. Their beliefs are shaped not by clarity, but by the need to belong. Their outrage is rehearsed. Their confidence was borrowed. Their rebellion, reactive, they appear free. But inside, they obey without question. They obey their past, replayed as guilt. They obey the voices in their heads that sound like parents, teachers, enemies. They obey every comment section that threatens exile for thinking differently. And when they finally rise to power, they carry those chains with them, disguised as ideology. This is why so many leaders become tyrants, and so many activists become authoritarians. They never conquered the real enemy, themselves. There's an old image, a soldier on a chaotic battlefield. Smoke fills the air. Screams echo in every direction. But instead of charging toward the noise, he does something strange. He drops his weapon and walks into a cave. Not to flee, not to surrender, but to confront the only war that matters, the war within. This is the path no one glamorizes, because inner conquest cannot be televised. It earns no applause. It demands silence, self-inquiry, and the terrifying courage to see yourself, not as you appear, but as you are. In Eastern philosophy, the same truth appears with different language. The Tao speaks of harmony with the flow of nature, not domination, but alignment. The Bhagavad Gita shows a warrior who must fight not out of anger, but duty. After confronting his deepest fears on the edge of battle, the message echoes across civilizations. The outer world mirrors the inner one. Conquer nothing within and you become a servant of chaos, even if you sit on a throne. We now live in a world obsessed with projection, with branding, with looking powerful. But discipline of the soul has become a lost art. We are told to express everything, act on everything, expose everything, as if freedom lies in never resisting impulse. But impulse is not freedom. It's slavery with better PR. Real power is restraint. The ability to feel without being devoured. To speak when it matters, and to remain silent when it doesn't. To hold fire in your hands without needing to burn anything. This is the opposite of performance. This is presence. The kind that unnerves people. Because it cannot be manipulated. It does not react. It chooses, and from that stillness, true leadership is born, not because you command others, but because you no longer need to. You become the one thing society cannot simulate or sell, a human being who is whole, unhooked from the levers of mass manipulation. This is not glamorous. It will not go viral, but it is the only revolution that cannot be undone. Because the world doesn't change when someone rises to power. It changes when someone walks into the cave and refuses to leave until their soul becomes the throne. Why? Do we worship those who stood alone, only after they vanished? We erect statues to the visionaries, the rebels, the prophets. But while they lived, we silenced them, mocked them, branded them heretics, madmen, threats to the order. It's only when their bodies cool and their ideas become profitable that we drape them in virtue. This is the paradox of true leadership. You must walk alone long before anyone follows. Real leadership demands something the world doesn't advertise. Not charm, not charisma, but isolation. To lead in any meaningful sense is to abandon the safety of consensus, to risk exile. To bear the weight of being misunderstood, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. This is not the loneliness of the outcast. It's the loneliness of the sovereign. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spoke of the knight of faith, a figure who acts in radical defiance of the crowd, obeying something higher than social approval. To do this, the knight must walk in silence. Even if no one understands, even if they look foolish, even if the reward never arrives, the knight's strength is invisible. Their faith incomprehensible, because it is not faith in a system. It's faith in the inner calling that refuses to be explained. Nietzsche took this further. His Bermensch, often mistranslated as a tyrant, was not a conqueror of others, but a creator of values. Someone who had passed through the death of all idols and still found the courage to affirm life. to lead not because the world agreed, but because truth burned too bright to stay hidden. But these figures don't begin as legends. They begin as threats. Prometheus defied the gods to bring fire to man, and for it, he was chained to a rock, his liver devoured for eternity. Galileo turned a telescope toward the stars and dared to say what he saw, and for it, he was condemned by the church and imprisoned in his own home. These were not acts of vanity. They were acts of sacrifice done in a crowd. The direction is decided. For you, the roar of the many drowns out the whisper of doubt. There is warmth in conformity, comfort in repetition. But to turn your back on the mass, to carve a path where none exists, to say what cannot be said and live it, that is a sacred burden. A figure stands alone in the middle of a tidal crowd. Every step forward is a defiance. Every silence, a rebellion. They are not admired. They are not followed. They are feared, because their presence exposes something we all try to forget, that most of us do not choose our path. We inherit it. We repeat it. We rationalize it, and then we punish those who dare to question it. This is the quiet cost of transcendence. The leaders we remember were not the loudest. They were the most resolute. They did not beg for validation. They stood in the storm and refused to kneel. They were crucified in life, deified in death, and mythologized in hindsight, because we need them. Not to follow, but to remind us that freedom has a price, and that the summit of self-mastery is rarely crowded. What if true leadership isn't about how many people follow you, but how deeply your mind resists being owned? For most of us, our thoughts aren't ours. We inherit them, absorb them, mimic them. We take in beliefs like we breathe in air, unconsciously, automatically. From childhood, school, news, memes, hashtags, gossip, and slogans, we are fed frameworks for how to interpret reality. We are taught what is acceptable to feel, think, fear, and desire. And like actors too deep into the role, we forget we were given a script. This is the architecture of internalized control. Not the tyranny of governments, but the tyranny of thought itself. Michel Foucault warned that modern power doesn't need prisons or chains. It simply needs mirrors. Because once you learn to monitor yourself, the system no longer needs to. He called it panopticism, the invisible cage where the prisoner becomes his own warden. You hesitate, not because someone is watching, but because you've internalized the gaze. This is how obedience becomes invisible. You laugh when you're supposed to. You get angry at the approved enemies. You feel guilty when you rest, ashamed when you fail, and outraged when the algorithm tells you it's time. But did you choose any of it? The most effective control doesn't look like control. It looks like moral clarity. It looks like popularity. It looks like wellness, like progress, like compassion. You're not punished for disobeying. You're punished for questioning. Not by the state, but by everyone around you. The group becomes the enforcer. You become your own censor. But what happens when you begin to notice? When the mask itches? When the slogans ring hollow? When your own thoughts begin to feel like someone else's voice whispering through your skull? There is a moment subtle, yet seismic, when you stop asking, "Is this acceptable?" and start asking, "Is this true?" This is where real sovereignty begins. Jiddu Krishnamurti said, "It is no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society." That sickness may not show up as violence or chaos. It often appears in silence, in numbing routines, in collective agreements never to speak of the lie beneath the surface, in the performance of sanity. While the soul starves beneath it, to awaken from this requires more than intelligence. It requires disobedience, not the loud kind, not the protest, but the quiet revolution of a liberated mind. Imagine standing in a hall of mirrors. Each one reflects a version of you, The student, the citizen, the believer, the consumer, the influencer, the victim, the hero. You've worn all the masks, performed all the roles, but now you stop. You lift your hand, and you peel off the last mask, not to reveal the real you underneath, but to accept that you are no longer playing the game at all. This is the mind that cannot be owned, that it does not need applause. It does not fear exile. It does not cling to ideology or identity like armor. It sees through the spectacle. It is free, not because it has the right opinions, but because it knows opinions are not truth. And this kind of mind is dangerous, because it can't be predicted. It doesn't follow trends. It questions when it's told to feel, and it feels when it's told to obey. It listens inward. And in a world trained to echo, it chooses silence over performance, stillness over speed, depth over distraction. The world tells you that to lead is to dominate, to climb the ladder, to command, to win. But that is not leadership. That is theater. Real leadership isn't about being seen. It's about becoming a light, even when no one is watching. There is an ancient story, older than empires, older than books. A figure climbs the mountain, walks into the desert, or vanishes into the forest, not to escape the world, but to return with something the world has forgotten. Truth, not a fact, not an opinion, but something deeper. A flame, and the moment. They return carrying that fire. The world either worships them or burns them. Prometheus brought fire to man and was chained for eternity. Socrates revealed inconvenient truths and drank poison for it. Christ preached compassion and was crucified. Galileo pointed a telescope and was condemned. They weren't hated because they were wrong. They were hated because they made others. See, this is the paradox of real leadership. It awakens others not through force, but through presence. Not by controlling people, but by awakening something in them that can't be controlled. Not obedience, but awareness. Once seen, it can't be unseen. Once lit, the flame spreads. To carry that kind of fire is to choose a path few ever take. You will not be applauded. You will be misunderstood, resisted, exiled, often by the very people you want to help. The crowd doesn't want light. It wants comfort, and comfort dies when the fire is lit. And still. You carry it. Not to be a savior, not to be followed, but because once the fire is in you, you cannot live in darkness anymore. You walk not ahead of others, but among them, not as a master, but as a mirror. You speak, not to teach, but to remind. And in that reminder, something ancient stirs. In them too. You become dangerous, not because you attack the system, but because you no longer need it. You no longer perform for its rewards, no longer fear its punishments. You are governed by something deeper than approval, something unnameable, something eternal. This is the fire you carry, and the moment you carry it, you are no longer a victim of the world, because the world can no longer seduce you or destroy you. Your value is not in what happens to you, but in what you choose to become through it. Pain becomes fuel, isolation becomes insight, and fear becomes the very door you walk through to find your strength. You become the monk who leads in silence, the prophet who is rejected, the child who tells the truth the king cannot bear to hear. You become what the world forgot, and now needs more than ever. Leadership, then, is not a destination. It is a vow, a silent promise to live with eyes open, to feel deeply in a world that numbs, to act when it's easier to conform, to hold the torch, not for praise, but because the path is dark and someone must see. This fire is not a gift you give. It is a question you awaken. And if you carry it well, those around you will not become your followers. They will become torchbearers too. So the question is not whether the world needs more leaders, The question is whether you are willing to become one dot, not by rising above others, but by descending into yourself, reclaiming what was buried, and emerging not victorious, but awake. Because once you carry the fire, you are no longer waiting to be saved. You are no longer looking for permission. You are the light in the dark. And now the path begins.